I spent pretty much the last 41 and a half years working at FDA in a variety of different capacities. But starting in the 1990s, I was the point person for the HIV/AIDS activist community. And I see that as the beginning, certainly at FDA, of patient engagement. And I thought I would start the topic off by talking about drug approval. And the purpose of drug approval from the FDA perspective is getting products to the market, therapeutics to the market, that are both safe and effective. And so they should be tested, or they are tested, in clinical trials that are prescribed. They have, based on scientific hypotheses of what are you looking for at the end, and how can you determine whether or not you've achieved it. So one of the great goals in science is to remove bias from your testing, to make sure that your hypothesis is shown it does or it does not end up being the outcome. And at FDA, people take that very seriously, and they have a lot of experience in looking at clinical trial design, because they've been looking at that certainly for efficacy since 1962. And it is a long process, and it is an involved process, and as we all know, there are a lot of people who can simply not wait for that process to get to the end. But when the process gets to the end, you have an approved product that's been shown to be safe and effective. Third-party payers, up until very recently, automatically paid for those therapeutics, and they become available to the widest possible audience because now they are on the market and reimbursable. Expanded access goes back to the mid-1970s, so it's really been around for quite a long time. It was initially used, cardiac and cancer were the first two areas where expanded access came into its own, but it wasn't until 1987 that it became codified in the FDA regulations. And that was at the time when AIDS activists were saying they really need to get access to drugs, but no drugs were on the market. So what came into the regulations was called a treatment IND. It allowed patients to gain access after there was some efficacy evidence and there was safety evidence about the drug, to make sure you were not putting people at risk, particularly without some defined benefit. And so that started a very long chain of expanded access that resulted in literally tens of thousands of people being in those expanded access programs. And I remember HIV and cancer programs being as large as 35,000 people who were getting treatment access outside of the clinical trial, which is essentially how expanded access is defined.
And just to clarify, before approval?
Prior to approval. So these are investigational drugs. They're being studied in clinical trials, but there are people getting access to them outside of the clinical trial for the purpose of treatment, not for the purpose of research. So the burden of data collection on those people is considerably lower. And the point of that was not to burden treating physicians in the community with having to collect the kind of data that researchers collect. And so consequently, that data is almost never used, but I can't say never. It's almost never used in the decision-making that has to do with getting a drug to market.
Is that the same as compassionate use?
Right. So people attach lots of different terms to expanded access. I use it because that's the regulatory term that's in the Code of Federal Regulations. People call it pre-approval access, special program, special access program, a lot of different names, but there are 3 tiers of expanded access for a single patient, for small groups of patients, and for large groups of patients. And they're generally based on how much information do you have about the individual patient for a single patient. So you can take a very large risk there because you know what their underlying medical situation is. Do they have hepatic function, renal function? How well are they going to metabolize that drug? What kind of risks are they put at? What other drugs are they taking? The more people you start to put into a program, the less you know about each one. So the agency feels there needs to be more basic safety information. And confidence about effectiveness is really not part of the calculation, which is, I think, why it's essentially called compassionate use. And so the agency has been looking at ways to make this more, how to facilitate access to this. In the last couple of years, the agency came up with a new application form, which is considerably shorter, and most recently changed the IRB requirements, Institutional Review Board requirement. That's an independent body that looks at the informed consent, the risk and the benefit of the patient. And because there were complaints about the fact that IRBs are so burdened with research protocols, sometimes it takes a while for the expanded access protocol to get before the IRB. So what we've been working on was, can we have one person from the committee, either the chair or a chair-designated member of the IRB, to look at that protocol, to look at the informed consent, make sure that the patient understands what they're getting into is experimental, that there are unknown risks attached to it because we simply don't have enough safety information. But essentially, the agency has what I consider an outstanding track record. The only applications that come into FDA are those where a company is willing to provide and able to provide the product to the patient or patients. And there are a lot of different reasons why companies may or may not decide to do that, but FDA has no jurisdiction to mandate that a company provide that drug. So it's completely up to the company who owns that drug. But the applications that come into the agency, which come in when a company says, yes, we're willing to provide that drug either to an individual or a group of individuals, is about 99.7% that are allowed to go forward. And of those, there are about 10 to 15% where there are changes in the protocol, because a lot of treating physicians don't have a lot of information or all the information about the safety of the drug. So the agency will meet or we'll talk to the doctor about changing the protocol to include some safety oversight or monitoring of that patient to make sure if something goes wrong, it'll be caught and they can change the dose, they can change the medication.
Let me
Yes.
jump in right